Alright, I'm going to read sessions 693 and 694. And so this one explains about no coincidences, but he explains that coincidences are merging probabilities. And then it's also going to talk about probable events. In one way or another throughout this book, we will be dealing with history as you know it and as you do not know it. We will be discussing in terms of the past of your species. In many ways, history is your built-in past, the obvious events that are significant. All of the different variations that can be played upon human consciousness, all of the racial probabilities are in one way occurring in ages past, but they are also happening in what you would think of as your present. As mentioned earlier, your consciousness seizes upon certain events over others and brings these into significance and therefore into the official reality that you know. Even in your private lives, however, there are clues as to other kinds of sequences in which events can occur and do. You are usually unaware of the significance of such hints. They pass beneath your notice simply because they do not fit the ordered sequence with which you are familiar. In your idea of reality, such clues appear insignificant. They make no sense, particularly in the order scheme of reality generally recognized. The cellular structure is innately able to follow such sequences. Believing such clues to be meaningless, the conscious mind does not perceive them, or calls them coincidences. Such clues in your intimate daily life, however, looked at in a different way, can tell you much about the potentials of the species, and give you glimpses of other systems of reality in which human consciousness can respond. I am here using an incident from the experience of Ruburt and Joseph, but the reader can make his or her own correlations and discover like events from which the same conclusions can be drawn. Driving through Sayre, Pennsylvania, one Sunday afternoon, Joseph noticed a house for sale in a neighborhood he knew, and remembered that it had belonged in his memory to a man of whom his mother had been fond. On impulse, Joseph had Ruburt call the real estate firm whose sign was on the house. The house was still owned by the man in question. Joseph only remembered his mother speaking of this gentleman in the past. In the recognized reality shared by the Butts family, there had been no intimate contact between Joseph's mother and Mr. Markle, as we'll call him. Joseph's mother had been greatly struck by the man, however, and was convinced that she could have married him instead of the husband she had chosen. Through the years, she fantasized such a situation. Mr. Markle was and is wealthy. Now, of course, he is an old man, unable to tend to his home any longer. He is now in a home for the aged, but well cared for. Joseph felt strong leanings towards Mr. Markle's home, though the price was quite high. Ruburt and Joseph thought about buying it and were taken through the home by the real estate people. A coincidence. A mere trick of fate that Joseph could be walking through the old man's home and that Mr. Markle would be spending his last time in a nursing home, as had Joseph's mother. Meaningless but evocative that this house was for sale and that the old man was insisting upon a price higher than the house was worth, just as Joseph's mother insisted upon a high price for her own home and determined to get it. That is how it looked from the outside. It appeared to be one of life's curious incidents. Instead, you have a rich interweaving of probabilities, for in one probability, the two were indeed married, and that Stella Butts saw the house go to the eldest son, myself, which would be Joseph. In this probability, this Joseph instead comes upon. The house of a relative stranger finds it for sale and can or cannot purchase it according to the new set of probabilities then emerging. This is a cross-blending of effects. In this probability, Joseph's mother left little in financial terms, relatively speaking, and her house was sold. The family did not get it. Now, all probabilities are related. Joseph's mother is dead, in your terms, and aware to some extent of the nature of her own reality beyond the physical. She is able, again to some extent, to follow through with her own probable existences. That is, she is conscious of her own being outside of the official framework. Her own psychology and characteristic methods of behavior are still hers, however, and operate so that she tunes into those areas of probabilities that concerned her own desires and interests. In this system, she wanted Joseph to have her own house, but for many reasons that did not develop. It was then at her behest to some strong degree that Joseph happened upon the Markle house in question, felt that he did indeed want it, and took the steps that he did in his reality. If your mother did not get the man and the wealth, then, to her way of thinking now, you can still get the house that she fantasized was her own during her life. She often dreamed of living in it. On a mental level and an emotional level, she used that probability in this life to enrich her own hours through daydreaming, but without, of course, any realization that those daydreams had their own reality. Even now she wants Joseph to have a finer home than either of his brothers has. You can cut that out if you want to. Okay, anyways. This is, however, a clear case of the interweaving of probabilities. In this one, Joseph can choose whether to buy or not, so there is no coercion, by Stella Butts, for example. Joseph and Ruburt were also shown a second house in Sayre, one a good deal cheaper, but generally much like the one in which Joseph's mother lived in this life. They saw both houses on the same day. The second, like the first, was for sale because of age. An elderly couple recently moved from the second house to a home for the aged. Again, the official mind says coincidence. All of this is quite natural. Many homes are for sale because the elderly can care for them no longer. The second house had no garage and was not in a fashionable... The second house had no garage and was not in as fashionable a neighborhood, but it had its own elegance. It made Ruburt now laugh with its odd nooks and crannies. That house did not have the weight of Stella's intent upon it, yet it was also a house that she had noticed, thinking it more grand than her own, one in which she could have been happy. It was her second choice. Okay, so bear with me, you guys. This gets really interesting, so keep listening. All right, so the real estate couple, the Johnsons, were also connected. Again, the official mind says that it was a coincidence that the couple were, in their way, artistically inclined, enjoyed painting and writing, freelanced, and still lived in an apartment after some years of marriage, and that the man was relatively quiet in contrast to the woman. Yet again, probabilities merge, for the woman could well have been a writer, the man an artist, and seeing Ruburt and Joseph, They related with other probabilities inherent in their own natures. The intent that Joseph's mother had lived lives beyond the grave in those terms. She still wants Joseph to have a house, and one that will be more fashionable and wealthy than her own. Now, Mr. Markle, a wealthy businessman, also had strong artistic abilities. He was a dealer in precious stones and fine antiques. These qualities attracted Joseph's mother, Stella, and with the situation as she set it up in that life, she was impressed, knowing that the man's talents would bring him wealth. His artistic leanings caused him to choose real estate people who had latent artistic abilities of their own. As the two couples talked, it turned out that there were other coincidences. Rupert and Joseph had recently thought of taking a weekend vacation at a particular resort motel within the general area, but not especially close by. This real estate couple had been forced to spend a night at the same resort due to poor weather, at a time when a psychic was featured as an entertainer. This psychic startled the couple by correctly identifying some specific elements of their experiences. So there was some kind of psychic connection also. Again, of course, coincidence, so says the officially organized mind. The rich interweavings of probabilities are apparent in all of your lives if you only stop organizing your perceptions and experience in Stop organizing your perceptions and experience in prepackaged ways. The many directions possible for the species exist now. Joseph reacted on a cellular level in one respect. The cells recognized the probable reality involved, and he, Joseph, felt that he was at home in the Markle place, and yet consciously could not explain the feeling. In certain terms, his mother will feel vindicated if Joseph buys that house, but the choice is still his and Rupert's. If you pay more attention to what you think of as coincidences, you will discover another kind of order that underlies the recognized order you follow. This has all kinds of implications biologically as far as the species is concerned. You can perhaps understand then that there are also probable histories beneath your lives, individually and in mass. The neurologically unrecognized orders can show themselves once you recognize their reality. Then your sense data will begin to confirm what has not been confirmed thus far. The apartment house in which Rupert and Joseph presently reside has a shared driveway. In certain terms, it is the connection, the symbol between the two probability systems. For Mr. Markle's house also has a shared drive. Rupert and Joseph live in double apartments in a large old mansion redone into such quarters. The driveway is shared with a very wealthy family next door, in which the same size house is a home to one family. Joseph's mother wanted Joseph to be very wealthy. The drive symbolically connects the two realities and is a point where the two merge. Okay, so this is session 694. It involves lots of things, but time structure, alternate man, probable man, and probable events continued. And it gets much, much, much more interesting, so keep listening. Okay, first, before I read the dictation, I want to read this. This is Rob's notes. He says, well, Jane said, indicating 2 points in front of her as we sat waiting for the session to begin. There's book stuff there to the left and stuff on me there to the right. But that's funny. I don't think of Seth being over there, just the information. It's as though I wait for the material to fall into a slot. Then Seth, who's here, she touched her belly, deals with it. I can sense the information outside of me, say, but I can't get it in my regular state of consciousness. When Seth comes through, he's at the same level the material's at, and he, or I, can then pull it in. It's as though there's a store of information there, but I have to go through a door of consciousness to reach it. All right, now dictation. The relatively insignificant example of probable events and their interaction just given provides a few important clues to the nature of probabilities in general. An organization is definitely present, but it is not the kind of order you are used to recognizing. This small private experience is repeated endlessly with different variations in all areas of daily living. That is, probable events constantly interact, and through their interaction, you end up with one recognized series of episodes that you accept, called physical reality. Underneath this recognized order of events, however, there is actually a vast field of ever-occurring action. These fields of probabilities are action sources for your reality, but your world action is also a source for these other probabilities. This applies at all levels, mental and biological. Probabilities involve the atoms and molecules, therefore, and the cells. They involve thoughts also, as well as more obviously physical events. Your bodies are probable constructs in that they exist only because of the atom's appearance at certain points of probability. At other levels, the atoms do not exist at those same points, and your bodies there are not the same physical constructs. They do not then exist there. Scientifically, with all of your instruments, you are thus far able to perceive the atom's presence only in the field of your own system of probability. Since you perceive physically through the body, which is atomically structured, then of course your sense of perceptions lead you to block out recognition of other probable stimuli or reactions. In his book, Adventures in Consciousness, Ruburt mentions what he calls prejudiced perception. It is an excellent term in this regard. Some of this is difficult to verbalize. The EE units, electromagnetic energy units within matter, within the atoms and molecules, are aware of the probable fields of action that are possible. While the body's integrity must lie in a constant reiteration in one probability, and maintain within the probable system a certain constant, and while physically perception is largely directed there, the basic integrity of the body system and consciousness come from outside the system into it. The atoms, while behaving properly within the system and seeming to adhere to its rules and assumptions, nevertheless actually straddle probabilities. Your time structures then are intimately connected with probable action and fields of actuality. In your terms, for example, it would seem as if Joseph could not have seen that house for sale until after a given series of events had occurred. It would seem as if all of this was dependent upon earlier events, his mother's prior meeting with Mr. Markle years ago, when both were young, her daydreams and fantasies in later years, her own death, Mr. Markle's old age, and his own abandonment of the home. In your terms, it seems that all of that had to happen before the house was put up for sale, so that Joseph, passing by only a few days ago, could see the sign and decide to look at the house. In much more basic terms, all events exist at once, even as atoms and molecules appear at once in all probable positions. The body, behaving in time, uses a time structure and acts in it naturally as its constant structure endures in time. So in that framework, time was experienced, and using that organizational structure, time seems to unite those events. Those events then arise into significance because of the particular kind of organization chosen. Other quite as valid events do not seem significant. They do not rise into perception or reality. They exist, however. In one reality, for example, Joseph's mother married Mr. Markle. Joseph inherited the home. In that reality, Mr. Markle died before Joseph's mother did, so there was no need for a Joseph here to even look for a house. He had one. In that reality, Joseph did not marry Ruburt, and in this reality, the one you and Ruburt know, Ruburt instinctively felt apart from that house. Okay, Joseph says, "Can I ask a question?" I disliked interrupting the flow of material, but this was a good time to mention what had been on my mind since Monday night. Seth says, "Yes." Robert says, "Well, I know you said in the last session that from her non-physical reality, my mother isn't trying to coerce Jane and me into buying Mr. Markle's house. Yet I keep wondering what others will think about the idea of influence being felt in our reality from the other side, you might say." Seth says, "Write your question down and I will answer it." Joseph says, "Go ahead, I can write it out later." And Seth proceeded to deal with the question in his own way. Seth says, "I made it clear that the decision rested with Joseph and Ruburt, but more than that, the whole question of a house of that kind brought into their own lives questions of values and prerogatives that were of great importance. They needed to encounter their own positions on such issues. Joseph was unconsciously aware of the first house of the two in Sayre, and could have chosen not to drive down that particular street, for example. Both he and Ruburt have thought relatively little about money or social status. They have lived in an apartment life instead, with little care for appearances. Yet there is always pressure in your society toward the acquisition of fashionable homes, and material possessions are often considered the medal of ability. Financially, Ruburt and Joseph were beginning to do well. Only then did conventional ideas come to the forefront. Those ideas themselves emotionally attracted certain aspects of Joseph's mother. Quite simply, in her terms, she wanted her son to do well, and to her that meant possessing an excellent home. On her part, it was an innocent enough ambition. When she sensed any strong feelings that Joseph also wanted such a home, then, in your terms now, she began, from her different framework after death, to bring that opportunity into his experience. This is not manipulation. It does show, however, that one portion of Joseph's mother, the portion connected to her son, still relates to him in a certain fashion. It also shows that his desires for a house in Sayre helped bring about certain events. He could have such a house if he wanted one. The episode also mirrored his beliefs, for to his way of thinking he would have to relinquish certain freedoms, and this he was not ready to do. The events basically exist at once, though at your level you have to perceive them in time. As your intimate daily reality can be involved with and colored by probabilities, brought into your experience by your own desires and beliefs, So is your mass culture, world history, and species orientation colored by probable events that do not fit into your officially recognized idea of physical reality. Alternate man, probable man, alternate use, probable use. These issues apply individually as well as in terms of the species, and they apply to your future as well as to your past. The greatest scientific discoveries are always accidents. They come from intuitional creativity, when suddenly a new kind of significance is seen that was not earlier predictable. You accept all data that fit your theories and ignore clues to the contrary. Yet underneath it all, you are significance-making creatures, pattern formers, immersed in time but basically apart from it. And so new insights come into your awareness and literally change the quality of any given reality at any given time. Joseph's mother is not only alive in another level of reality, but still learning. She is quite aware, therefore, of his decision not to buy the Markle house. In her level of reality, she was aware of the fact that Joseph wanted the house strongly, that one portion of him thought of possessing a large home, even though this would require upkeep and attention that another part of him did not want to provide, because he felt it would take too much time from his painting and our work. The portion that momentarily desired the house immediately attracted the same kind of desire always felt on the part of Joseph's mother. This, on another level of activity than physical, reactivated old conflicts between them. For a while their desires united them. Now, however, Stella Butts is better able to understand her son's reactions. Through his decision in this reality, she is finally beginning to glimpse the reasons for his actions in the past that before were incomprehensible to her. Try to understand that all of these reactions are really happening at once. Joseph's desire at this end attracted his mother's like desire. In your terms, however, the reactions continue.